Hands up. This is a robbery. Good to see you, everyone. My name is Robbie Howell. I am a tabletop game designer, a history enthusiast, and a lifelong player of Age of Empires 2, and welcome to Theorycrafting. In this show, I take civilizations not yet present in Age of Empires 2 and try my hand at creating a fitting and historically accurate design for them as they might appear in-game. Today, we are going to be revisiting a good friend of the channel and longtime viewer, the fantastic Johannes Eyjolfsson, who returns to us with another killer Scandinavian collab. He helped out a lot with this build. Show him some love down in the comments section below. And without further ado, today we round out the trio of Scandinavian superpowers with the Norwegians. Yes, the Norwegians, the final piece of our longtime project of subdividing the Vikings, which means that we've finally completed a full civilization subdivision on this channel. Johannes has been an indispensable part of at least 2/3 of this cycle. Again, huge thanks to him, and this Norwegians build will be the most similar to the current Vikings civilization of all of the 3 Scandinavian civs we have covered. As always, if you want any disclaimers on this process or insights into my philosophy when I am approaching a theory crafting build, take a look on screen right now. And as always, if you want to see any further details on this build, on the units, on the technologies, on the tech tree, anything else, take a look at my civilization document linked down in the description, which also contains all of Johannes's and my sources. And without further ado, let's move on to Norwegian history. As with most Scandinavian civilizations, Norway had a pretty substantive history before the Viking Age, but they really only started to make a dent on the medieval world once the Viking Age arrived in force. Norway is, of course, a rather inhospitable place, and as such, its peoples had a particularly large amount of incentive to go out into the broader world and see what they can find in other fairer pastures. Now, I should note before we begin that the story of Norway would never be complete without strong mentions of its 2 sisters and neighbors, Sweden and Denmark. I've already done builds on both of them. Go take a look in the cards up there if you want to see more. And just suffice to say that at pretty much any given point in Norwegian history, Denmark and or Sweden is meddling with them in some way or another. Pre-800 AD, most of Norway was ruled by a bunch of different petty kings who had like a slice of the country. These kings were all pagan and fiercely resisted both early attempts to Christianize them as well as incursions from their Scandinavian neighbors and their northern neighbors, the Kvens, and to a lesser degree, the Sami. I have those here represented as the Cumans, though they certainly weren't Cuman. Maybe we'll see those two on the channel someday. And so out of this turbulent environment, the Norwegians struck out across the Great North Sea to test their luck on the British Isles. It is hypothesized that they may have been behind the initial raid on Lindisfarne Abbey in Ireland, which kicked off the entirety of the Viking Age, though some sources also say it was the Danes who perpetrated that particular one. What is known, however, is that the Norwegians made a substantial impact on the British Isles within the first couple decades of the Viking Age proper. Not only did they establish colonies on Shetland and Orkney, which lasted long enough to become fully ingrained and assimilated into those local cultures, but largely driven out by the 900s, unlike the Danes, who left a much more substantial impact. But the Norwegians didn't stop with the British Isles. No. The Viking era brought them into contact with probably more of the world than either of the other 2 Scandinavian Viking powers, or dare I say it, any other civilization the world had ever seen up until this point. Not only did the Vikings make their way happily down into Western Europe, most notably leading to the founding of the province of Normandy within France, which was settled by a Viking ruler who then pledged loyalty to the King of France himself, but also along the Iberian coast down into North Africa, into the Mediterranean Sea, of course along the many rivers of Eastern Europe, coming into contact with the Kievan Rus, the Byzantines, and a whole host of other peoples, though of course the Swedes had a bit more control over the eastern side of things, and having plenty of fun down in the Mediterranean. Mediterranean as traders and mercenaries. There are even accounts of Norwegian Vikings making it as far south as the Red Sea. That's not to say that south was the only place the Norwegians went. They of course settled Iceland, which existed as a relatively autonomous independent country for several hundred years before being assimilated by Norway more properly. And from Iceland, they of course famously made their way to Greenland, founded a colony there, and under Leif the Lucky made their way all the way to America, sailing all the way off of my presentation slide into the great unknown. Not to mention colonizing a couple of other islands in the Arctic Ocean that wouldn't be touched by any other power for many, many centuries beyond. But the merry, merry Viking Age was not to last forever. No, indeed, civil war quickly came to Norway. It was nominally unified and Christianized in the mid-900s, but this unification effort took quite a lot of effort. The many petty pagan kings were very reluctant both to lose power and to lose their faith, and as such, the royal line of Norway would spend the better part of its first century in power stomping out various rebel factions that kept popping up right under its very feet. But a power it became, and post-Christianization, it was strong enough to actually draw the ire of its Scandinavian sisters, who, alarmed by the amount of power it was accruing, created a coalition to defeat it, culminating in the Great Battle of Svolder, and led to a significant reduction in Norway's power, not to mention a whole bunch more civil wars. The matter of succession ended up becoming a serious problem due to a very, very dumb law put in place by the first great Norwegian king, Harald Fairhair. The rule was that as long as an heir's claim to the throne was sponsored by someone in power, they had a right to rule, which meant that literally anyone in any sort of power could just say, oh, you have an heir to the throne that I need to accept and effectively live under your yoke from now on. Well, funny that. I happen to have an heir to the throne right here. Time to fight a war, shall we? And so these wars of succession went on for quite a number of years. In fact, over a century. And eventually it crystallized into two major factions, namely the Begelers, who to simplify it were the noble royalist faction backed by the church, and the Birkebeiners, a scrappy bunch of guerrillas who weren't about to accept an illegitimate heir's claim. But after many decades of fighting, the two sides largely reconciled, a Birkebeiner-sponsored heir took the throne, and a century of peace followed. These were Norway's halcyon days, where they saw the greatest prosperity they had experienced since the early days of Christian unification. But once again, this was not to last forever. The Kalmar Union quickly came to power. If you saw my Danes video, you'll know what this is, but for everyone who didn't, the German Hanseatic lead was starting to dominate trade in the Baltic. Denmark said, oh no you don't, that sounds very dangerous. They established their own trade union among Scandinavian powers and effectively used this as a Trojan horse to take de facto control over the entirety of Scandinavia. The then Norwegian king was effectively a puppet to the great Queen Margaret of Denmark, and Denmark's hegemony was so great and so well entrenched that Norway was effectively its puppet for the entire remainder of the AoE2 relevant time frame. Hence why I have 1397 as the end of the period we'll be looking at for this Norwegians build. That's when the Kalmar Union took over, and when Norway, at least for the medieval era, functionally became Denmark's vassal. But after this exciting history of exploration and rebellion, where is Norway today? Well, they were effectively traded between Sweden and Denmark right up until the early 1900s, at which point they were able to claim their independence. And since then, they've been doing very, very well for themselves. Their vast supply of natural resources has led to one of the highest GDPs in the world, and they have one of the strongest independent economies in Europe. And so I think we can say that despite being tossed around for the majority of the late Middle Ages, Norway came out of it looking pretty good overall. Let's move on to the flavor. What are some of the specific details that I have chosen out for this build alongside my good friend Johannes? Well, first of all, their architecture will be a new set that will also be shared by the Lithuanians, the Swedes, and the Danes, that being a Baltic architecture set. After doing so many of these Scandinavian builds, I've come to the conclusion that the Central European architecture set just doesn't quite cut the mustard. It's just too Germanic looking, and I think we can do better. Now, I don't have any prepared examples for you here, but maybe down the line I'll have a presentation for you to look at with a couple of cool examples of what this hypothetical Baltic architecture style might look like. Now, since it's shared by several other civilizations, the Norwegians would have unique skins within this Baltic architecture style, both for their castle, as per usual, and for their barracks, which is a very important building for this civilization. Additionally, the language spoken by the Norwegians would be Old Norse, Gvedir, ladies and gentlemen. This would be somewhat similar to what we hear from the Vikings in-game currently, but with a little more attention to historical detail. Their wonder would be the exact same that it is now, the Borgund Stave Church. It's a beautiful building, and to use a phrase that you will rarely hear me say about Age of Empires 2 civilizations, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Let's move on to some campaigns for the Norwegians. There are no shortage of exceptional characters in Norwegian history, but I'd like to start with perhaps the most iconic ruler they ever knew, that being the globe-trotting Christian king Olav Tryggvason. After a tumultuous upbringing, Olav first made his mark on the world in Eastern Europe, where he lived in the court of Kiev during its initial founding period under Viking control, before making his way west. There, in early medieval Germany, he met and wooed and wed a Wendish princess, and it is likely at this point that young Olav first became Christianized, fighting alongside her in a great crusade against the then pagan Danes. From there, he made his way home to Norway, took the crown, and began a ruthless campaign of consolidation and Christianization that would see Norway at its very height during the AoE2 relevant time frame. Olav gained so much power in Norway that it was because of him that the Swedes and Danes formed a coalition to take him down at the famous Battle of Svolder, one of the largest naval engagements known to the world at that time. Olav died in the process, but left behind an absolutely towering legacy. What a Chad. This guy is just so cool and led such a varied life. First as an adventurer, then as a crusader, then as a king, only brought down when numerous neighbors allied against him. He's an obvious pick for a Norwegian campaign, but I think there are some other good options too. The next being Harald Hardrada. If you haven't heard of Harald Hardrada before, first of all, what are you doing? You gotta go look him up, man. He is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting men in history. His epithet, Hard Ruler, was earned during his early days as a mercenary in service of the Byzantines, where he fought all over the Mediterranean and Black Sea at the head of a Varangian contingent. From there, he made his way back to Norway and put his epithet to use as he started to consolidate power in a way that hadn't been seen since Olav Tryggvason. As he became stronger, he began covetously eyeing Britain, which he had some dubious claim to rulership of. If you don't yet know the story, suffice to say that Harald's claim to England ended disastrously for him at the famous Battle of Stamford Bridge, but the ambition and drive shown by this man easily earns him the title of one of history's maddest lads, and I don't have anywhere near enough time in a presentation like this to do his story justice. Look him up if you hadn't before. I think he'd be an awesome campaign protagonist, but I want to mention one final one, that being a joint campaign, where you start playing Eric the Red and finish by playing Leif Erikson. Right now we have these two partially represented in the very silly Vinland Saga scenario, which very loosely tells the story of how Eric the Red discovered America. Which he didn't do, by the way. Eric the Red stopped at Greenland. It was his son, Leif Erikson, who discovered America. And as such, I think it would be quite cool if you started the campaign playing Eric during his days of exile from Norway and Iceland, moving up into his settlement of Greenland, and from there follow Leif down into what we now know as Newfoundland, and join him in the early days of the first European settlement in America and his many interactions with the local Thule people who he knew as Skraelings. Some good, most bad. I think that Leif's discovery of America is one of the most interesting stories in all of history. I actually wrote a paper on it back in high school, and so it is very near and dear to my heart. As such, while I think that Olav Tryggvason and Harald Hardrada are more compelling traditional campaign protagonists, I just couldn't leave Eric and Leif off the table. I would love to see the shitty Vinland Saga scenario fleshed out into a campaign more worthy of their accomplishments. Before we move on into potential campaign appearances, I just realized I forgot to include AI player names in this presentation. Sorry about that. Just suffice to say, they are on the Civilization doc, so check that out if you'd like to see some examples of what AI Norwegian enemies you might face in random maps, but let me know down in the comments whether that's something you'd really like to see in presentations from now on. I only tried it out for the first time last time in my Swahili's video, and so I'm still very much open to input on this. Now, onto some potential campaign appearances. Current campaigns, that is. First of all, Hastings. You actually get to see Harald Hardrada in that campaign, so obviously he would be represented by the Norwegians. And similarly, the Vinland Saga scenario. I really don't like it. I'd like to see it turned into a campaign, but if we had to keep it, it would obviously be a shoo-in for the Norwegians. Let's touch upon a couple of other campaign ideas that I would be remiss not to mention. First of all, Harald Fairhair. He is the first true king of Norway, the entire succession crisis that came as a direct result of his stupid law, and he admittedly did do a lot of work in consolidating the various petty kingdoms of Norway into one relatively contiguous Christian kingdom. That being said, a Harald Fairhair campaign would almost solely be him fighting other Norwegians or Kvens, which to me is a little bit boring. Plus, he's just not nearly as cool as some of the kings who came in his stead. So I would personally pass on it, but I wouldn't fault anyone for going with him instead of some of the other ones I've listed. Another one, Hrolf the Ganger. You might know him better as Rollo, a Norwegian chief who led a pack of Vikings right down into North France and created what we now know as Normandy. Unlike other Vikings of the time, after taking what he wanted, he actually swore a pledge of loyalty to the King of France, and his house would go on to become one of the most powerful and valuable assets that France would ever know. In fact, William the Conqueror is likely a descendant of his. And even if not, it's undeniable that without Hrolf's work, Normandy, and thus William, and thus England as we know it today, would almost certainly never have happened. Interesting dude, could make for a great scenario, but we have so many other strong contenders that he didn't quite make the cut for me. And lastly, Halfdan the Black. He was one of the final petty kings of a non-unified Norway. Harald Fairhair's father, in fact, and he had quite a swashbuckling life in his own right. A pagan lord facing intense opposition, Kven raiders, and his wife being apprehended at one point, culminating in a dramatic rescue of her that I think could make for a very, very cool final scenario in the campaign. A very exciting story, but not great civilization diversity, nor as much historical oomph as I might like, so I'd say he'd be at the bottom of my personal wish list. Now, with campaigns covered, let's round off the history section with major themes, overarching patterns that Johannes and I started to notice when combing through Norwegian history. Well, first of all, they were the heralds of the Viking era. They had, from what I could see, the biggest reach of any Viking power. Not only spanning multiple continents, making their way into America, making their way all the way down through Eastern Europe and into the Middle East, and possibly even Western Asia, making their way into North Africa, these guys were everywhere. And while they didn't do quite as much settling as some other Viking powers, they were behind some of its most famous events, such as probably the sacking of Lindisfarne, the founding of Normandy, and the discovery of America. They might not have been the stickiest Vikings, but man, were they pervasive nonetheless. Theme number 2, factional civil war. Norway was plunged into over 100 years of civil war because of that stupid succession system that Harald Fairhair, or maybe one of his advisors, very ill-advisedly put into place. Now, one side in these conflicts pretty much always had the church on their side. The church in Norway was very important, and part of the reason it was so important is that pagan uprisings were more common in Norway than they were in any of the other Scandinavian countries. The church was, in general, less popular in Norway, but still had a good amount of wealth and clout on its side. It just meant that whoever had the church on their side wasn't automatically the winner, unlike in many other European countries. And for theme number 3, adventures in the wilderness. The Norwegians had several of what I like to call globetrotter kings. People like Harald Hardrada and Olaf Tryggvason who crossed the globe and back before settling in Norway and laying their rightful claim to the crown. You don't often see that in rulers of countries. Norwegian leadership was just particularly full of daring do's. And on top of that, of course, Norway was responsible for some of the most spectacular settlement stories in all of medieval Europe, settling Iceland and Greenland and Vinland and all these other lands and all these other places, and almost always they were shitty places to live with inhospitable climates or inhospitable natives or some combination of the both, and yet the tenacious Norwegians stuck through and managed to carve out niches in many of these lands that they tried to settle. Back in Norway proper, there was even an entire caste of people called the Markamen who are known to live on the edge of society, effectively like borderlanders. Since Norway was never a very populous place and was rather inhospitable even in its homeland, these people on the edge of society had so much more influence and control than in any other European state. In fact, the Birkebeiner faction that I was discussing earlier was comprised largely of these Markamen, who came together to put a check on the perceived excesses of their noble higher-ups. And with that, we come to the end of the history section. Thank you so much for watching. If that's all you were here for, make sure to like and subscribe before you leave. And for all those of you who, like me, love Age of Empires and want to see what Johannes and I have done with the Norwegians in terms of implementing them into the game that we love, let's move on to the game mechanics, beginning with some necessary updates. If you've watched my Swedes and Danes videos, you would know that I've proposed a number of regional Scandinavian units to be shared across all of these civilizations, beginning, of course, with the Viking. This would be a regional starting scout unit, trainable at the barracks from Dark Age with relatively weak stats. It cannot hold a candle to an eagle or a swordline unit, but it is able to build longships on coast tiles. What are longships, you ask? We'll get to that in a moment. But more interestingly, whenever the Viking is attacking an eco unit or building, it will generate gold over time. If it attacks an eco unit like a villager or a trade card that is holding resources, it will even steal those resources outright. They will even ungarrison relics from monasteries if they attack a monastery that's holding one, making them a very useful utility raiding unit that can play hell with your opponent's economy and gives yours a little bit of a boost. They are relatively cheap at only 50 food and 10 gold, and are affected by supplies for minus 15 food. This will all be familiar to you if you watch the Swedes and Danes builds. However, Johannes and I have made a change. Introducing a new Imperial upgrade, the Jomsviking. This will be available to the Swedes as well as the Norwegians, though not the Danes. It is effectively just a stronger version of the current Elite Viking, no better at the whole raiding and pillaging side, but with substantially better offenses and defenses, allowing it to be more of a linebacker in your late game death balls while retaining some useful raiding utility. The Jomsviking, a new addition to the Scandinavian regional unit set. Secondly, the longship. Vikings can build them, but so can docks from Dark Age. They replace the transport ship for Scandinavian civilizations. In Feudal Age, they actually gain an attack. This attack only comes into play, however, when they are garrisoned with units. If they don't have anyone inside of them, they can't shoot. They're very, very fast compared to transport ships, but are substantially flimsier, and really cannot hold a candle to any other ship on the water, except for kind of fire ships, which they trade better against than galleys, but still lose 1v1. They're pretty cheap though, only costing 80 wood and 20 gold, and as such, similar to the Viking, are a cheaper utility unit that can be used to supplement late game armies after contributing some mobility and raiding potential in the early and mid game. Now, the Norwegians actually have a unique upgrade to the longship that they get in the Imperial Age, the Ormrin. Unlike the Jomsviking, the Ormrin is exclusive to the Norwegians and is just a much better version of the previous Drakkar upgrade. Unlike the longship, the Drakkar can actually shoot by itself when not garrisoned, and the Ormrin can shoot multiple javelins when not garrisoned, making it function a lot more like the longboats that we know and, in some cases, love. But wait! There's more! What you say? Another Scandinavian regional thing, Robbie? You're spoiling us. Yes, indeed, my friends, another regional thing for the Scandinavian civilizations, this being a regional technology available from Dark Age at the town center called Althing. Now, Althings were effectively a political congregation where early Scandinavian communities would come together and do things like resolve conflicts and pass laws. The Althing largely vanished as an institution as Christianization took hold and kings gained more centralized power, but in the pagan days, Althings often served as the beating heart of Scandinavian communities. And how have we chosen to represent this piece of history? Well, Althing will, as mentioned, be available at the TC from Dark Age. It's available to all three Scandinavian civilizations, and it gives bonus train time and HP to all of your villagers. This is a pretty substantial bonus, like plus 20 HP to villagers and plus 20% bonus train time, but this bonus diminishes as you increase in age. It starts really good in Dark Age, but by Imperial Age, you lose the bonus outright. It goes all the way down to 0, representing how the Althing was phased out of Scandinavian societies. Now, Norwegians are unique in that they do not lose Althing bonuses in Imperial Age, because the Althing remained as an institution in Norway well after it died out in other Scandinavian countries. But even so, this boost is still very, very small in Imperial Age and will still largely be an early game benefit that you need to pick up soon if it's going to be any sort of worth it. Althing is quite expensive for Dark Age technology, costing 50 food and 100 gold and taking 30 seconds of train time. According to the numbers I crunched, this means that if you research it in Dark Age, you're going to have to train at least 5 or 6 more villagers to recoup the train time lost alone. Though after that, you'll see some pretty good benefits from this technology if you choose to prioritize it. You won't be able to get Limb though, and it does cost a whole villager's worth of food. An interesting trade-off, don't you think? Let's move on to an overview of the civilization writ large, with these regional units in our mind for context. The Norwegians, an infantry and naval civilization. First bonus. Villagers work faster, scaling up to 40% in Imperial Age, and remotely deposit all their resources when they are unable to see any other friendly villager. Woo, that's pretty exciting. Homesteading was extremely common in Norway, and between societal castes like the Markamen and the Norwegian tendency to go off and settle these horrifically hostile lands in these tiny colonies, you can see why Johannes and I went for a bonus like this that really encourages you to spread your economy out as thinly as possible. If you can pull this bonus off, it will get you some really stupendous gains, but of course it does make your villagers far more vulnerable and will be increasingly hard to do as the game goes on and you start having so many villagers that there's really no way of spreading them out such that they cannot see each other. Either way, a very powerful early eco bonus that I believe will have a very, very high skill ceiling and a good amount of risk associated with its high level of reward. Full credit to Johannes, by the way. He came up with this idea by himself during one of our first design sessions, and I think it's one of my favorite parts of this civilization build, so show him some love down in the comments, guys. Alright, second bonus. Infantry unit upgrades each give an additional +5 HP. This is our take on the current Viking flat plus 20% HP to all infantry boring thing. It roughly comes down to the same thing, but in summary, it makes the sword line much better on this Norwegian build than it is on the current Vikings, and is not quite as impactful for things like their halberdiers, which the Norwegians do get, even though the Vikings were limited to just pikes. Not quite as impactful in an early man-at-arms rush as the current Viking bonus is, but much more impactful in late-game brawls. Third bonus. All ships cost 5 to 20% less scaling up by age. This is once again a very clear allusion to the current Viking bonus, but it just scales a little bit differently. It will make the Norwegians less overwhelming on early water than the Vikings are now, but will make them better on late game water, which I think is an acceptable trade-off. The Norwegians were obviously exceptional shipwrights. They arguably had even better shipbuilding traditions than their Scandinavian sisters, and amassed huge armadas during their heyday. A bonus like this is just an obvious pick, and also of course pays homage to the current Vikings, which while I don't think is mandatory, is still something I like to do when I see a good opportunity for it. Fourth bonus. All, yes, all Norwegian units move between 2.5 and 15% faster scaling by age when more than 10 tiles away from any building. Ships benefit doubly from this bonus. Rebel groups of Norwegian Markamen were known for their remarkable slipperiness when faced with much stronger and better equipped troops. They knew the backwoods extremely well, allowing them to run laps around their chasers, and also famously mastered the use of skis to quickly traverse inhospitable snow-covered hills. This bonus is meant to represent this ranger-like aptitude, as well as Norway's many great quests of oceanic exploration. It'll certainly help them explore the map much faster than other civilizations, especially when on water. On to their team bonus. Buildings train foot soldiers 33% faster when under attack. 33 is a very, very big deal, and foot soldiers here applies to any military unit not on a horse, excepting ships, siege, and monks. Norway was, of course, plagued by rebellions, and as such, this bonus is meant to represent the more general militarization of the era, with rebel levies popping up out of nowhere at the slightest sign of opposition from their higher-ups. I think it'll be a very versatile bonus that will help the Norwegians and their allies on the defense, but even more significantly will make the Norwegians very, very good at proxying, which, as I will get into a little bit later, is probably going to be one of the cornerstones of their general strategy. Let's move on to their unique units, beginning with the Berserker. The way that Berserkers are currently depicted in-game makes me sad. They are horned, helmed axemen with dumb capes and big red beards, and that is so very silly. Berserkers obviously have a lot of mythologies surrounding them. They certainly existed and were certainly elite infantrymen, and while they probably didn't have the many supernatural powers that were attributed to them, it's very likely that they were exceptionally well trained, and that stories of these mythical exploits were part of what gave them such a ferocious reputation in the eyes of many enemies of the era. And so our Berserkers not only are wearing an actual animal skin, as befits their name, but they are also wielding a sword, which literally every depiction of a historical berserker that we know of shows them to have preferentially wielded. Johannes's and my berserker build costs 75 food and 35 gold, very expensive for an infantryman, but you're getting a lot of bang for your buck. The berserker is very, very strong, with well-rounded stats and few weaknesses, and it has a very powerful ability. After a berserker is brought to 0 HP, it will keep moving and fighting for 3 seconds before dying. If it happens to get healed above 0 HP during that time, it will actually stay alive and live to fight another day. Like I said, it's hard to detangle mythology from history with berserkers, but there are stories of Norwegian warriors, such as the great berserker of Stamford Bridge, holding firm against absolutely insurmountable opposition despite horrific mortal wounds and still bringing down enemies with them. So I think an ability like this is quite fitting, despite it probably being just a little bit magical. Now I should know that the berserker also benefits from an awful lot of technologies, supplies, gambesons, and also from the unique technology Markamen that we will get to shortly. It is almost a horseless knight in terms of its power, and a lot of Norwegian strategies will likely revolve around making use of the berserker as an inexorable threat that your opponents have to deal with before they get to their front lines. A single siege onager shot, while it will kill the berserkers, will not stop them from wreaking havoc before they die. Now, moving on to the next Norwegian unique, they have a unique replacement to the galley line, that being the Knar line. Most notably, the Knar has its gold cost swapped for food, meaning that the Norwegians have trash galleys, which sounds terrifying, but don't worry, there is a trade-off. The Knar is weaker than a galley, having noticeably worse defensive stats, but is a good bit quicker and has better line of sight, as well as being faster to train. Its offenses are also less than a galley's, however, so anytime you're in an actual conflict with Knars, you're probably going to be on the losing side of it, and you really have to leverage its other strengths. The Knar's upgrades are also slightly cheaper and faster than those of a galley. It upgrades to the Snekka in Castle Age, and then from there to the Skave in Imperial Age. While these units will be able to hold their own against other naval forces, they're always going to be a little bit worse in terms of their overall staying power, so you'll have to supplement with fire ships and long ships like the Ormren, as well as relying on your late game ship discount bonus to outvalue your opponent even if you cannot outgun them. The Ormren we have already touched upon, so let's move right along to unique technologies for the Norwegians, beginning with their Castle Age unique technology, Markamen. This makes it such that all infantry and foot archers, including skirmishers, gain 2 bonus line of sight and slowly regenerate HP when affected by the Norwegian unique civilization speed bonus, namely when they're more than 10 tiles away from any building. We've talked about why Markamen are important to Norwegian history enough that I won't bore you by going over it again, but suffice to say that this technology will greatly facilitate raiding and make things like mid-game Viking raiding or early Imperial Arbalester play particularly sticky and difficult to deal with. In Imperial Age, the Norwegians have Konungstekja. This was a type of royal procession after an heir was sponsored, where they were paraded through all sorts of different Norwegian cities in order to be accepted and fawned over. Did it actually work out that way? Typically not. This technology makes it so that enemy town centers and castles are converted when brought below 25% HP rather than being destroyed. This is of course in reference to the many rebellions and civil wars that happened as a result of the very silly heir selection system in medieval Norway. So rather than destroying your enemy's bases, you're just convincing them that your heir is legitimate. Now I should note that if you are playing a team game, the Norwegians have to do the majority of the damage for this bonus to kick in. They can't just get the last hit when their opponents do all the work in bringing a building below 25%. But assuming the Norwegians make good use of this bonus, it will allow them to pull off some incredibly rude plays. It will mostly come into effect when stealing enemy castles, with enemy town centers mostly being icing on the cake, but when you do manage to swipe an enemy castle, oh, that will feel very good for you and very, very bad for your opponent. You do have to mostly destroy it though, so it's not like it will be completely insurmountable if your opponent loses a castle in this way, but a great way to rub salt in the wound while also advancing the proxying strategy that I envision this Norwegian build often going for. As always, if you want to see any of the specific details behind any of these bonuses, any of the numbers, notes, or corner cases, check out the civilization document down in the description. Let's move on to the tech tree for the Norwegians. The letter grades, as always, beginning with their infantry. It's an A+, ladies and gentlemen. They have some of the best infantry in the game, in my assessment. They have the unique Viking, upgrading all the way up to the Jom's Viking. They have their mighty Berserker unique unit. And Markamen is a nice bonus in Castle Age. They also have a perfect barracks tech tree. They do have the Halberdier, unlike the Vikings. They have their infantry HP bonus, and they have their training time team bonus. Wow, that is so many bonuses stacked on top of each other. You cannot tell me that this will not be a good infantry civilization, and I see one of the best ways of using their infantry being sticking barracks right up in your opponent's grill, producing raiding parties that benefit from Markamen and your civilization's speed bonus, and when your opponent tries to destroy them, you mass up a counterattack faster than they're expecting it. It's a great infantry civilization and deserves nothing less than an A+. Archers, it's a B. They have Thumb Ring. They have fully upgraded Arbalists. They have Markamen, which is quite nice, but they miss Hand Cannoneer, Heavy Cavalry Archer, and most notably, Bracer and Ring Archer armor, meaning that their archers are going to be absolutely at their best in late Castle and early Imperial Age before lacking Bracer really bites them in the ass. They do have their train time team bonus, they have Markamen as mentioned, and archers do benefit more from that movement bonus because they'll tend to be further away from buildings in the first place, but you'll never want to really focus heavily on archers in the late game except as raiding units. As such, can't give them higher than a B. Cavalry, it's a D. It's poo. They don't have Hussar, Paladin, Bloodlines, Husbandry. Pretty much anything you'd want for your cavalry they don't have, except for the final armor upgrade. Yes, their cavalry are benefited by the speed bonus, but they don't have Husbandry, so is it even really worth it in the end? D. Siege, though, is a B+. They have Siege Engineers, which is always nice, and I would argue Kononstekia is kind of secretly a siege bonus, because you're mostly going to be weakening castles to the point that you can capture them using things like trebuchets and siege rams. And so, while they lack Siege Onager and Bombard Cannon, I think their siege very much merits a B+. Their defenses, on the other hand, are doo-doo. It's a D+. No keep, no fortified wall, no bombard tower, no architecture, treadmill crane, hoardings. It's just bad. Good thing they don't have hoardings too, because they'll be stealing a lot of castles. So when you're playing the Norwegians, you almost never want to be on the defensive. You want to be up in your opponent's face. You want to be proxying them. You want to be stealing their buildings. You want to be raiding them constantly. Because if they mount a substantial offensive against your defenses in the mid and late game, you're pretty much boned. Their economy, it's a B+. Once again, a very, very weird economy with a lot of moving parts. They are missing a couple of late game technologies, but they have Althing in early game, which is very, very impactful. And they do have that lone villager harvesting bonus, plus their move speed bonus helps their economy too a little bit. I envision this being a very hard economy to get optimal use out of. I could see some players really getting serious value out of things like Althing and the lone villager bonus, while other players just choose to play them conventionally and ignore all the extra bells and whistles. I think that they even might have A or A- potential here, but I'm going to go with a B+ because of how many hoops you have to jump through and how admittedly vulnerable their economy is. If, for example, you focus on Althing, you don't get Loom, and as such you miss out on the extra armor. If you're scattering your villagers, it's a lot harder to protect them, etc., etc. Levies. It's a D+. It's not looking good, guys. And while they do have fully upgraded Halberdier, their elite skirmishers late game are missing a bunch of upgrades, their hussars are missing a bunch of upgrades, and as good as fully upgraded Halberdiers are, they do not a levies grade make. I could see the argument for C- instead of a D+ here, but I would personally never want to play the Norwegians in a trash war scenario. Especially because by that state of the game, most of your bonuses won't be very helpful anymore. There's going to be a lot of buildings, so things like Markamen and your speed bonus won't help very often. Yeah, it's just not an optimal situation for the Norwegians, though their Halberdiers are very good. Their dock, it's an A. They have the Longship fully upgrading to their unique Ormrin ship, which is very cool. They have their unique galley replacement, the Knarrline. I've had a lot of really, really good naval civilizations recently, which I kind of dig. And in the case of Norwegians, all they miss is the Demolition Ship and the Cannon Galleon. They also have, of course, their ship discount, which is nice, and their big move bonus, which is even nicer, because that move bonus is going to be much more relevant for ships than units, because you can't build buildings on the water, and as such, no matter what stage of the game it's in, you'll be able to zoom your little shipperoonies all over the map. Only thing that holds the Norwegians back from an A+ is that their ships are on average a lot squishier than normal. The Knarr line is weaker than the galley line. The Longship line is not really known for its defenses. Plus, no cannon galleon will make it a little hard for them to land in really, really late game post-imperial scenarios. And lastly, for monks, it's a C-. They don't have redemption, which sucks. And so you use monks for monk things. I've been saying that a lot recently. God, I frickin' hate monks. If only there was a video coming out next week that will possibly bring some solutions and color to monks and religious units in general, such that they're more interesting and varied and we can have other strategic options for them, and maybe, just maybe you'll see it on this channel. Let's move on to the playstyle that I envision for this Norwegians build. In the early game, you have some awesome rushes at your disposal. You have the standard militia into man-at-arms, your archers are very, very decent, and you also have Vikings at your disposal. You have speed and bulky infantry on your side, and both of those things are great for rushes. And all of this is enabled by that hypothetical proxy economy, allowing your villagers to be hyper-efficient, though very, very exposed. In fact, it makes it a lot easier for your villagers to go up to the front lines to build forward barracks and stuff like that, if they can just hop on a tree and cut away happily while waiting for something else to do. I think the Norwegians will be one of the best rushing civilizations in the game, only held back by their lack of bloodlines on their scouts. They also, of course, have really good early water. The Knarr and Longship, not to mention the Viking once again, are all quite useful on water maps, and the Knarr in particular will allow you to have a food and wood only economy on water maps if you wish, not putting any villagers onto gold until you need to go up to Castle Age or pick up fletching, which I think could really help smooth out some of that awkward early transition and of course synergize as well with your fishing fleets bringing in tons upon tons of food. Now, into the mid-game, the Norwegians will have really, really good archers and still a very solid infantry frontline. Infantry are typically not what you want to be doing in mid-game, but with something as powerful as the Berserker at your disposal, you might be tempted to go for it. Your crossbows, though, will be excellent. With Markmen at their side, you will be able to take and hold map control, proxying buildings all over your opponent's front line, and using your fast, high line-of-sight units to zip around, pick off enemies, and jump in on their economy wherever you see vulnerabilities. If your opponent is proving a tough nut to crack, once you hit Imperial Age, you might be able to pull off a couple of cheeky little castle steals thanks to Konungstekja. But once Imperial Age starts to take its full toll, your non-infantry military will really start to fall off. You have really good infantry, don't get me wrong, but you can't spam it out quite as easily as someone like the Goths, and as such, the Norwegians will definitely have an overall disadvantage late game on land maps, especially since their civilization bonuses like their movement speed are just less good with so many more buildings being thrown down everywhere. Your water, however, stays very, very good. The Norwegians have great late game water with the Scathe and Ormrin, as well as fast fireships at their side. They have an incredibly fast and mobile, not to mention very cheap navy, that can chew through enemy navies with sheer numbers and efficiency, even if the ships individually might not always be able to trade 1v1. Certainly don't underestimate cheap ships. Current Vikings show how strong a bonus like that can be. Lastly, let's touch upon some loose threads for this civilization build, questions that weren't quite answered as Johannes and I were making our way through the design. Let's begin with a couple of uncertainties. We are not really sure about the current implementation of the Knarr. Johannes really wanted to see a unique galley line replacement, and I really like the idea behind it, but a trash ship is a very underexplored idea. It's not even really clear whether it will be a strict benefit in all situations, though I do think it will be a benefit overall on average. And I like the trade-off of speed and cost in exchange for power and defenses. There just might be a slightly more historical way of going about it. Second of all, that villager gather bonus is pretty extreme. There's a lot of intricacy to it, and I think it's very skill testing. I really like the bonus, but I could see it being kind of polarizing. You really have to know when to use it and how to position your villagers such that they aren't easily picked off by even just a single enemy scout, and as such, it might be just too drastic of a direction to take the Norwegians' primary economy benefit in. On to some tabled ideas. Bonuses, unique units, and similar that didn't quite make the build, but were considered at one time or another. For one, we never really crystallized what this would look like, but something referencing Norway's many late pagan holdouts could be quite cool. An idea for this one just never manifested. Another one, the Knarr having a secondary melee attack. This was one of my earlier ideas of how to distinguish the Knarr from the galley line. Maybe when it gets up close and personal, a bunch of the guys on board try to board the enemy. Of course, with the Vandals build, you guys know that I tried a boarding mechanic as well. I think it was quite cool, of course, but as many comments pointed out, people want to see boarding be a more broad-scale change to the game rather than just a single gimmick on a single civilization. So I learned my lesson with that one and will not try another boarding mechanic until I have a more proper water rework ready for you all. Nextly, Konungstekja effect being two-way, so your enemy can steal your castles and town centers. Obviously, this is pretty weak for an Imperial Age unique technology, but it could work as a Castle Age unique technology, or maybe even as a team bonus. This is one we considered a little earlier on as very, very warping to how the game would be played, but certainly would be fun. Nextly, some regional options. What if the Huskarl line that I proposed on the Vandals were implemented for Scandinavian civilizations. Heavily armored bodyguards of this nature were very pervasive across Europe. Plus, the Norwegians and the Scandinavians more broadly already have the Viking as a unique regional infantryman, so I didn't want to go too crazy with the barracks, but this is definitely something I would consider doing in future. And plus, another unique regional technology would be the current Danish unique technology for the Imperial Age called leding. This was a common practice across all of the Scandinavian countries, and while I wouldn't make it do exactly what it does on the Danes right now, I could very much see co-opting it into, for example, improving all ship and infantry train times, for example. There's a lot of ways you could go about a technology like that, but right now, I really love the role that it serves on the Danes, to the point that I wasn't too keen to change it up and rebalance what I already think is a pretty well-designed civilization and technology. Hirds and Hirdmen. We did consider having those as maybe a unique unit or a unique technology. Really weren't sure on the effects, and they are pretty close to the Huskarl line that I proposed for the Vandals and Germanic civilizations, but the idea crossed our mind, and maybe a skinning of the Huskarl line as Hirdmen could be a way of doing it. I'm not sure. Another one, a unique Markemen or Birkebeiner unit. Obviously, we have Markemen as a technology right now, and I very much like what it does, but as a unique unit, what if they were a weapon-swapping, skiing anti-monk ranger? Like a fast melee guy that could swap to a bow, and when it was going downhill, it was faster. Woo! So many cool options. But the Berserker is iconic, and I did want to keep it in the game, even if I wanted to dramatically change what it was like, so the Birkebeiner was put on hold for now. Definitely a consideration for future. Lastly, we had a couple of other unique technology ideas that all were pertaining to different Norwegian political institutions. The Gulatinget and Frostatinget, for example, were streamlinings and modernizations of the old Althing system made by later Christian kings. Maybe they could continue Althing's bonuses into late game. And Landslov was an officially unified code of law introduced by another later Christian king. All of these are pretty well-grounded technologies that all kind of follow the same through line of legalism and social reform. They just weren't nearly as exciting as the ones that we had, and I couldn't quite find a way to tie a historical effect for them into the identity that we had been designing for the civilization up until this point. And with that, we've finally come to the end of this long-awaited end of the Scandinavian Triad. Thank you so much for watching. Before we sign off, let's take a look at the likelyometer. In my opinion, how likely is it that the Norwegians, maybe looking something a little bit like what you see here, could appear in the game in future? And on the likelyometer, we have a 6.5 out of 10, the exact same as the other Scandinavian civilizations. As mentioned in the Danes video, I think that a Scandinavian DLC is possible in future. Do I think it will happen soon? No. I think it won't happen for another 4 or 5 years at the very least. But if we ever do cycle back to Europe, I think a Viking subdivision is a distinct possibility for the game, but that's just what I think. Now I want to know what you think. How do you like the build? A big round of applause for Johannes. Thank you, my good friend. He's a great guy. He's a great collaborator. And with him, I think we've made something really special here. But I would like to know, how do you think we did? Are there any elements of the history that you think we didn't address properly or we missed out on? Are there any elements of the build that are completely off balance? You guys are always good at catching that. What would you have done differently with a Norwegians design? And lastly, what else would you like to see me do on this channel going forward? As a final reminder before we sign off, remember that the Theory Crafting finalists have been announced. Remember to go and vote for your favorite build. The finals will only be open until this coming Sunday at midnight Eastern Standard Time, GMT -400. So make sure to get in your vote for your favorite build before that elapses. I can't wait to see who wins it all. I very much hope you enjoyed the live stream and, like me, are absolutely blown away by the amount of talent shown by this little community we're cultivating together. But until then, my name has been Robbie Howell. And ciao for now.